Thank you very much. Professor Mohan Monasinghe. He is the chairman of the Monasinghe Institute for Development, located in Sri Lanka. He is the Director General of the Sustainable Consumption Institute of the University of Manchester of the UK. He is co-winner of the 2007 Nobel Prize for Peace, being Vice Chair of IPCC, and he is also Honorary Senior Advisor to the government of Sri Lanka, Colombo. So Mohan, can I ask you? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. First, let me thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a very great privilege. I must thank you, the audience, for showing commitment and staying here so late. You will save the world because you have the commitment to do that. Now, very quickly, I'm talking here about integrated solutions because there's a growing risk of global breakdown because the shocks are coming repeatedly. There's a financial economic crisis that is going on. There's a problem of persistent poverty and inequity. There are resource shortages, energy, water, food around the corner, potential environmental harm that is nothing to do with climate, but other types of damage. And of course, climate change is perceived as the ultimate threat multiplier because it makes all the other threats much worse. Now, these problems are interrelated, they are synergistic. Unfortunately, we have heard stakeholder interests are very divergent, the responses are uncoordinated, and there is a noticeable lack of political will. So we face this possibility of a breakdown of the global system, and already you can see sort of walls building where the rich live more and more in protected enclaves, the poor live outside, and there are barriers in the mind as well. So how do we overcome this? Now, let me dwell a little bit on climate because I work on climate with the IPCC. The two most important parts of the climate change report, which is this thing, in my mind, is first that the poor countries and the poorest groups will be affected the most. It is very unfair because they had the least to do to cause the problem, but they are going to be affected the most. The second important point, which is relevant, is that if we make development more sustainable, we can deal not only with climate, but with all the other problems as well. So we don't treat climate as a special problem, but as a part of making development more sustainable. This is the path of integrated solutions. Now, the first thing we have to do, and we are bringing in the theme of breaking down walls, is that there are barriers of the mind. These are the most important ones. One is the question of unsustainable values. We need to rebuild the ethical and moral principles, and basically, among the youth especially, greed and selfishness, which have driven our civilization for a long time, are clearly unsustainable. We must have much more selflessness, altruism, and particularly enlightened self-interest, which shows that if you help the other person, you help yourself. Without these values coming up from the bottom, we will never change the world. Of course, we have... I get 30 seconds extra. We have to also break the disciplinary boundaries because as academics, and we think this is not only a question of physics or chemistry or medicine, it is all of the above. And particularly for the young people, you have to think much more broadly. This is a very important point. We have to think in terms of big spatial dimensions, the whole globe, not our community, long time spans, decades or centuries. And particularly we have to break stakeholder boundaries down because people should not think selfishly. I'm thinking particularly of the fact that governments are increasingly incapable of solving these problems. We have to bring in civil society as a major stakeholder, business as another stakeholder. And they must help government, not just criticize, saying the politicians are bad, but work constructively with governments to solve the problem. Now, let me just tell you a little bit about values because this is very essential. If you look at the present economic and financial meltdown, which is a bubble caused by greed because driving the value of assets well beyond their true value, when the bubble bursts, what happens? A few people have made a profit, large numbers of innocent people have to pay the price, taxpayer. Now, basically, the $4 trillion, $4,000 billion were found to solve this problem. But there are other bubbles. There's a bubble of poverty which is hidden by growth, because we talk about growth, we don't talk about the unequal income distribution. 2 billion poor people in the world. But for this bubble of poverty, only $100 billion a year are given. 1/40th of $4 trillion that was spent to bail out the banks, right? And then we look at climate change, which is a third, an environmental bubble. Again, it is the principle of use now, pay later. Few people profit today, many pay the price later. For climate, we're just spending a few $1 billion. So what are the values and priorities of our society and of our governments? This must change if we want to survive. Very quickly, let me summarize what we need to do. First is the economic stimulus package. Much more should have gone for green investments, for productive social support systems to help the poor, and so on. Much more. Korea has spent 70%, I was just in Korea last week, 70% of its green investment, of its stimulus package went for green investment. Most other countries only 10%. It's just for consumption expenditure, which is business as usual, back to the old path. We need to boost poverty reduction and those things, build those things in now. Manage market reform, certainly. And in the long term, we have to build for sustainable development. And this is use the momentum for change, because people realize now that the world is not working well. We have to think not only of the economic dimension, but also the environmental dimension of sustainable development, and last but not least, the social dimension, the social capital in people, in you and I, working together. So unless the economic, the environmental and the social are given balanced treatment, if you only focus on the economic, it will not work. And transforming the global governance structure, I mentioned something very quickly, that in many meetings for the last year or more, I've said, certainly the move to the G20 away from the G8 is a good, it's more democratizing. We have to make the governance system of the UN more effective. Certainly the World Bank and the IMF must be democratized to give the developing countries a bigger say. And I have also proposed that they establish a C20, that is a group of civil society leaders who will advise the G20, and B20, a group of business leaders who will also advise the G20, because we cannot leave it to governments alone. Let me finish by just giving you a very quick glimpse of Copenhagen. For the last year and a half, I've been advising the Danish Prime Minister's office, which is very concerned with this, and the quick framework of what might emerge is the following. You know that as income goes up, emissions go up, right? The developing countries are low in their emissions and low in their income, but the rich countries are high up in their emissions, well above the safe level, and also high in income. Now, the first step is, as recognized in Kyoto, for the rich countries to bring down their emissions. And this is absolutely necessary, but they can do it without reducing the quality of life. We know enough, it is not rocket science, it's just lack of political will. We can have the good life, but still be responsible in reducing, making our consumption patterns, you and I, to be more sustainable. The second requirement is think of the poor. We must have a safety net for the most vulnerable countries. Think of the Prime Minister of Maldives who was underwater showing what is going to happen to his country. So we must have a safety net for adaptation for those countries. The third element is the countries that are growing. They also have a responsibility. Instead of growing on the same profligate path of the rich, the high path, they can flatten their growth curve so that their emissions will be less. Again, we know that they can reach a good quality of life, but with a much lower emissions through leapfrogging and new technologies, and also better practice, which we know now. So that is the second, the Indias, the Chinas, the Brazils, they have to do that. And last but not least, there must be technology and financial transfers, again from the rich countries, to help these countries find that flatter path. That is the type of global cooperation we need. Unfortunately, Copenhagen may not be as well as we thought, but it is the start of a process, and I expect to see you there to help us achieve this. Let me end by saying the following. We can start now to make development more sustainable. There is no excuse to wait. But unless we make that step now, and I put the blame on my generation, we will not give the space for the younger generation to take the next step. Because in 20 years, we want a world that is driven by social justice, that is looking at power structures, fundamental values, changing the ethical and moral principles of society, using new technologies, Twitter, whatever, new political processes. But to open that door, we have to make the start now. And that transformation must begin now. So I end with a message of optimism, Mr. Chairman. 30 seconds. We have multiple global problems, they are very serious, but we know enough to start now. We can make the start now, and we can take the first steps towards a sustainable development. By dealing with these crises in an integrated way, business and civil society have been working with governments, breaking down mental barriers and working towards a new 21st century of sustainable development. And I'll tell you why I want to be optimistic. First, the alternative is unthinkable. We cannot afford to fail, our generation. And secondly, when I look at the young people and the hope and the commitment in their faces, I know we have a chance. Thank you very much indeed.